Today's show is brought to you by TestCube. Are flaky tests slowing your Kubernetes deployments? TestCube powers continuous, cloud-native testing directly inside your Kubernetes clusters. Seamlessly integrate your existing testing tools, scale effortlessly, and release software faster and safer than ever. Stop chasing bugs in production. Start preventing them with TestCube. Check it out at testcube.io/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. October 12th, 2025. We are in the midst of fall. Hope everybody is starting to enjoy the weather, starting getting planning for Q2. And I just got back from a week in South Africa. So actually a week of PTO, doing some stuff around the Midwest of the U.S. and then down to South Africa. So 2 weeks on the road. It's good to be back. Good to be recording another show with y'all. And wanted to dive into kind of, I've had a chance, I don't know, over the last 4 or 5 months to have a whole bunch of conversations with different companies about their AI strategy, mostly, sort of talking to executives across different organizations in different parts of the world and so forth. And it's very interesting to have those conversations, especially in the context of the AI news that we tend to talk about all the time when we do, cloud and AI news of the month, where everything seems to be sort of dominated by, the 5 or 6 largest AI companies, massive investment, massive, VC funding and all sorts of things like that. And it's a very different conversation to be having with, sort of enterprise customers, so large organizations and banks and healthcare companies and governments and all sorts of things along those lines. It's just a very different conversation to have. And I thought it might be sort of interesting to dig into it a little bit, without sort of revealing the specifics of any of those conversations. I think there's a perception that what's happening in sort of the leading edge of generative AI. So, what OpenAI is doing, for example, or the big deals that NVIDIA is doing with people, and what Oracle is doing is representative of both the consumer space, the B2C space, if you will, and what might be happening in the enterprise or the B2B space. And I thought it'd be interesting to sort of dig into some of that. So let's jump into that right after the break.
Agriculture, the world's most vital industry, is on the verge of a digital makeover. On Interconnected, a new show by Equinix that explores the hidden infrastructure behind our connected future, they explore the ways edge computing, AI, and other modern innovations are reshaping how food is grown, sent, and delivered. Global agri-food leader Christine Gould lays out the digital challenges farmers face and where change is already sprouting. Listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I kind of want to dig into some conversations that I've had and a bunch of observations that I've had, kind of just tracking, where companies are in terms of sort of their adoption and more of a B2B adoption, an IT type of adoption, all those sorts of things. And I want to kind of frame this in the context of something I put in the title, which is sort of the 5/10/85% reality of enterprise IT. And, this is not intended to be sort of a, pour cold water on the movement that's happening with AI. I think, as we've covered a lot on the show, there are a lot of interesting things happening. You could look at them as being very positive. You can look at them as being very speculative or bubbly. But there's a lot happening. There's a lot of interest in this stuff. And it's, as we talked about, it's an interesting new technology because it is something that, unlike a lot of things, right? So, Kubernetes or some, new Java thing or whatever, it feels much more like the iPhone in that it's something that literally everybody has some level of experience with it. It was very easy to sort of pick up. You can start to do interesting things with it. You start to see where, it's going to have impact from a technology perspective. But at the same time, unlike the iPhone, it also has, a bunch of sort of big unknowns, right? And I guess the iPhone would have been sort of like that, right? We didn't really know what it was going to become, at the time. It could have just been, another phone like we thought about. But it's an interesting, sort of discussion as you get into it and transfer it into sort of what we think of as the more traditional sort of IT environment or sort of enterprise environment. And what I mean by the 5/10/85 reality is this. I think, and again, these numbers might be slightly off. Don't take them as sort of definitive, deep research by anything, but it really is sort of a a smattering of conversations that I've had, and a lot of sort of looking at what's in the marketplace and hearing cross-checking with a lot of other people. So the 5% piece of it really is, of the the companies that you would think of as sort of like enterprise government sort of companies, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, 2000 types of companies. I think about 5% of them have a very clear vision at this point, even though we're only a few years into the sort of generative AI era. They got started fairly early, probably within that first year or so. They were doing experimentations, and about 5% of them have a clear vision of how to apply both predictive AI and generative AI to a set of use cases that drive differentiation in their business, productivity improvements, cost reductions. And so they're sort of they've been ahead of it. They've started to do the things that you could have learned from the early days of cloud in terms of setting up centers of excellence, identifying, how to go about doing things, sort of taking an AI first mentality, not trying to necessarily bolt it onto stuff. And I think there are a number of companies that are doing that. You don't necessarily hear about them. And, the more I've thought about that, this is why we haven't yet really seen sort of the Netflix of enterprise AI, the way we sort of did with sort of the Netflix being the Netflix of cloud. Is I think those companies, and I've had a chance to talk to a few of them, like they are kind of keeping what they're doing under wraps because it is, while I guess they could use it in a way to do some recruiting, I think for the most part they recognize it is a competitive advantage to them, and they don't really want to necessarily go and share it. And so looking back on it, even thinking about like what Adrian Cockcroft was doing in the early AI day or the early cloud days, kind of talking about what Netflix was doing, I think that. I think we're going to look back at that as it being somewhat of an anomaly in terms of sort of the early leader kind of sharing how they did things. And obviously they were doing some of it because they were trying to recruit and they were trying to drive, some things that were, outside of their core business because they were thought of as, the people that sent out DVDs. So they were really trying to use that availability and awareness of recruiting. I think in the AI world, it does feel like a pretty small community, and I think they're probably, these companies, these early adopter 5% companies, are probably not having too much problem recruiting, although they are probably going up against, some of the very, very deep pockets of Silicon Valley, but places like New York and San Francisco and others, and London and Singapore and others don't really have any problem, especially in those environments, being able to recruit fairly high end talent. So. I think we're gonna see that, and we won't necessarily hear too many of those stories until they've probably adopted it to a point where they feel like they are several years into having advantage over their competitors. They've established what they're trying to do, and maybe they'll be moving on to their next generation, and they'll start talking about sort of the first generation of the things that they had done. So that's the 5% piece of it. The 10% number is really sort of a set of companies who have allocated somewhere about 3 to 5% of their IT budgets to IT or to AI. They have gone and gotten a C-level mandate. It might have come as a C-level mandate, but they basically said like, hey, we know there's opportunity out there. Instead of going after a bunch of little projects, we're going to try and allocate a reasonable size amount of money for the year. And in many cases, they've kind of just gone and said we're going to give that money to either Microsoft or Google to give themselves access to the frontier models of OpenAI or of Google. And a lot of this is in the context of, give me a Copilot or give me a Gemini. I'm going to apply it to all of my knowledge workers, my white collar workers, whatever those things might be. I'm going to apply it to my software developers. And I'm going to try and start applying it to some number of use cases. Oftentimes, document or text centric type of stuff. So it could be assisting marketing teams. It could be, with legal and compliance. It could be whatever it is. And we've seen these companies sort of, tout out, hey, look, we have rolled out AI to 20,000 people, 50,000 people, whatever it might be. They're able to check the box and, they're sort of able to say, yes, the business is AI enabled. And when you get a chance to talk to these folks and you go, okay, well, what does that mean, right? Like what how do you know that you're AI enabled? What are some of the use cases? How are you measuring productivity? And in a lot of cases, they sort of, they give you that look of, well, we don't totally know yet, right? We're not totally sure, but we went through the process of getting the funding allocated. We didn't want to go on do it on a project by project basis. We really said, hey, the company needs to jump in with both feet. And so they've sort of done that, and the thinking about the budgeting piece of it or thinking about the ROI piece of it kind of becomes secondary to them being able to go, did we roll this out? Can we measure how many people are starting to use it? And they're not really too worried about the ROI piece of it. They really want to do that. And part of it is, we've seen this with a number of companies. They then are very quick to signal to the market, hey, we are AI enabled. Our company is AI enabled. And they're smart enough to realize that at this point in time, the stock market is valuing those companies, especially if they can allocate, some portion of what they're doing with AI to their revenues, right? So a new service they've rolled out or something, they recognize that the market is valuing dollars associated with that at a much higher premium than is happening in other places in the market, right? So think of it this way: if you can allocate or you can associate some amount of what you're doing as AI, AI related to your product as opposed to sort of the standard part of your product, the market is giving it a much higher multiple in terms of going, okay, if that's growth that's associated with AI, it could be AI related financial advisors or something along those lines, where it's like, okay, this is our standard financial advisor and this is our AI financial advisor. Maybe that's giving you a 10x or a 5x or a 20x sort of incremental difference between what you do standard. The market is sort of rewarding you in that way. Now, not rewarding you necessarily in the multiples that an OpenAI is getting or an NVIDIA or whatever, because you're obviously not in the pick and shovel business that those folks are. You're not necessarily changing the world, but you have a multiplier that is impactful on that, right? Now, what's interesting in those cases is, as you talk to those folks, depending on if they have been doing this for more than a year, right? So in some cases you will talk to these companies and they've been doing it for a couple of years, and they are already starting to recognize that the cost of doing these sort of mass co-pilots, mass Geminis and so forth is turning out to be fairly expensive given the ROI that they have, right? So when you go into these projects, because a lot of times when you talk to these companies, they will go, well, we started down the path of saying, hey, what do you think people can do? And they got overwhelmed with hundreds of, hey, we could do this type of projects. And what they ultimately kind of decided was, I don't want to be in the business of allocating small amounts of budget for hundreds of projects and then having to sort of keep track of those. Again, they sort of collectively said, hey, let's just kind of go to the board or go to our executive team and say, let's allocate a percentage of what we do. Let's give it to everybody. Let's let 10,000 flowers bloom. If we could give our people these tools, they will start to figure out interesting ways to do that. And what tends to turn out is, in some cases, people start to figure it out because it is such a new tool. And if you kind of apply it back to the sort of 10,000 hour rule, right? It's going to take people multiple years to start figuring out what to do. And if you don't give them a specific set of like, hey, we want you to focus on this stuff or these new behaviors, whatever, it's going to take them a while to do that. And so, the sort of secondary thing that we start to hear from these folks is, they start to get into the mode of going, I don't know necessarily, especially if they've been doing it for more than a year. So they've had to renew a dollar amount, or the dollar amount's gotten larger, right? We've already seen, a number of some of these sort of Gemini Copilot things where customers are saying, hey, I want to opt out of including that uptick, that premium thing into my Office 365 or whatever it is, right? They're like, I don't need you rubbing AI everywhere with what I'm doing. And ultimately what they're figuring out is there's not yet an understanding in the marketplace of understanding, what am I supposed to pay for AI at the enterprise level, right? They don't know if that means, should I pay on a per seat license basis? Should I pay on a on a bundle of token basis? Should I pay for it on a action done basis? Whatever that thing might be, that's not a clear understanding. And then it's also not an understanding of like, well, how much should I be paying to enable a certain job with AI, right? How much should I enable a manager? What should I pay to enable a manager? Do I think of it as a percentage of their salary? Do I kind of baseline? Like, all those things really aren't well established in the marketplace yet. And so, we are beginning to see and hear some of those enterprise companies go, well, right now I am paying on a per seat basis and then some basket or bundle of tokens. And I don't really know how to measure that. And in some cases, we're running out of tokens because people are using the more advanced versions of the model. In some cases, just like we've seen with other licenses, they don't value every single person having a seat license at the same level. So they're looking for, okay, can I get a high level for certain people and a low level for other people? And there's not necessarily an easy way to do that. And so, you do start to hear people say, well, should I be thinking about this in terms of like, enterprises like to think about stuff in terms of unlimited, right? Like I don't necessarily know how to forecast this stuff. You, as the provider, don't necessarily give me the best tools to forecast this stuff. It's all very new. I would just sort of like, some sort of unlimited thing so that I will pay up to a certain price, but I don't really know if I would exceed that. And then I would love some tools that help me sort of measure this. And right now that doesn't really exist. So you're starting to see some people come back and say, hey, I don't want to be in the tokens as a service business. I really kind of want to be in the GPU as a service business, right? I want to provide GPUs to my people, or access to GPUs, GPUs plus models and so forth. But I don't necessarily know how to meter it and so forth. So, I think we're hearing from a number of companies that like the cost of this stuff is starting to become questioned. We've seen various reports coming out. We saw the one from MIT saying like 95% of companies that are doing stuff, haven't seen the ROI that they expected. Now, part of that might just be, some posturing to get better pricing. Part of it might be, they truly don't think they figured out what the right use cases are, and that's going to happen sometimes when you don't start with that sort of 5% mentality. But we are seeing that in the marketplace. But at the same time, a lot of times those folks are going, well, I feel very bold about where we are today. We did enable 20,000 people like overnight to have this AI service, right? And then there's the other 85%. And the other 85% ish, could be 80%, whatever it is. They aren't really sure what use cases to focus on, right? And then when they do focus on them, they have kind of unrealistic expectations for still a very new technology. And this is the, kind of yin to yang to AI is, on one hand, all the demonstrations, all the prognostications are, this is going to be super intelligence. This is going to be amazing stuff. This is going to be, in many cases, smarter than, the majority of the people in your organization doing certain things. And they sort of set unrealistic expectations, right? So it's like, well, if it's supposed to be amazing, then I should be getting 99.999% accuracy without having to do anything. It should understand stuff, and it should just dynamically learn my environment, and it should, be able to help scale across different parts of my organization. And I think what we realize with that is they go in, they haven't gone through that early phase of sort of experimentation with stuff that could have any sort of expectations. And then they end up focusing on a lot of the sort of what I'll call no areas, right? So security is not good enough, or isolation's not good enough, or whatever those are. And some of those are very valid, right? Like it's like saying to a hospital or an insurance company or a bank, well, don't worry about your compliance rules. Don't worry about your guardrails to prevent fraud or to prevent theft or whatever, right? Like those are very, very realistic. But I think what we've seen in sort of the 85% of them is, they try and apply that same highest level to their various POCs without sort of going, well, this one maybe doesn't necessarily need to be at 99.999%. It could be 92% accuracy because, quite honestly, like, maybe our customer support things that come out of the call center, whatever, really only about 85% accurate, or even 92% accurate, but it takes 100 people to be 92% accurate. And maybe with an AI agent or a chatbot or whatever, you can do it with half the people, 10% of the people, whatever that thing is, right? So you see a lot of that where, the appetite for experimentation, the appetite for trying to move fast and break things isn't necessarily there. Again, some of this just comes from your sort of traditional IT sort of mindset of, it's easier to say no to things than adopt new stuff and have to learn. So that's sort of another area of that. So that's sort of the breakdown of what I call my sort of 5, 10, 85 kind of breakdown of where enterprises are. Now, again, don't take that as sort of a negative thing. There are plenty of pockets of use cases in which companies are, successful with this stuff, right? In some cases, it's Gen AI. In some cases, it's, raising the predictive type of work that they have been doing, into the realm of, hey, those are also going to be part of the AI use cases. So I think we're starting to see some of that is the recognition that, some of the, not everything has to be Gen AI. Some of this stuff can very well just be predictive, kind of classical predictive type of work. There's a number of other sort of things that are interesting. I think, there is quite a bit of interest and demand for like private AI or even sovereign AI, and this is again driven whether it's because of the political things that are happening in the world, whether it is regulatory types of things, whether it is just thinking about, hey, where's my data primarily located and how do we operate? The challenge to that is enterprises don't have easy access to GPUs outside of SaaS services, right? And we're seeing so many of these deals happening, whether it's an open AI or whatever it is, and again, they are taking up the vast majority of capacity, and so it does become harder and harder for enterprises to get access to GPUs that they can have control over. In some cases, they're having to buy multi-year packages to be able to get access to those things, and again, that sort of defeats the purpose of sort of what we saw at the early days of cloud, which was experimentation and on demand and all those kind of things. So, the GPU access is still not as simple as it was when it was CPU access for the cloud in the early days. And then I think there's two other things that are still sort of a struggle for enterprises that, while there are lots of headlines about stuff, I think the first one is right now there's no simple way for enterprises to build AI agents, right? There are plenty of AI agent tools and frameworks, so LangChain and Crew AI, and there's lots of other ones out there, but most of them require a decent amount of coding experience. They're not yet to the complete simplicity of sort of your no code type of drag and drop stuff. They still require a certain amount of sort of coding experience or some amount of that. And again, I think to get to a point where you're going to be able to give teams the independence to start to augment the work they do and understand what they do, their domain expertise with agents, we're going to need some more simplified things. We're going to need some standards around that. And so, I think we're a little ways from some sort of where that are. Nobody is really broken out to be, the de facto kind of agent builder or, the de facto sort of framework for doing that. And especially to somebody to make it simple enough that domain experts can start to build those things to augment their team or to take on new challenges, and then also be able to plug it into, the types of third-party tools, MCP servers, authentication systems, and stuff like that. That stew just isn't. I mean, is it doable? Sure, people can put the pieces together, but it's not yet. Nobody's really quite yet figured out, how to do that on a simplified basis yet. Even the people who you would expect, like a Microsoft or somebody who has experience in building these things, and then. I think the final thing that enterprises are struggling with, and this became kind of relevant and more visible, in the last couple of weeks as we started to see some of these new tools roll out from, the open AIs of the world and even the metas of the world, is the interesting dynamic of, people are very used to the chatbots of the world, and they're used to, Meta AI and chat and open AI and Gemini and so forth, and then you're starting to see more tools start to roll out in those ecosystems. And a couple of things are coming out of that. One is, while we're seeing some of these like video tools, so a Sora or I think it's called Nana Banana or, whatever, what it's sort of fleshing out, and it may not always be obvious, is like the experience with AI in the case of the things that you're doing around pure intelligence. So like a ChatGPT is a very individualized experience. Right? It's not something that is easily shared. And if you think about that in the context of an individual or, even a small startup or something, or, a research scientist or something, like it being an individual experience is fine. Right. But if you think about it in the context of like an enterprise, or you think about it in something that is going to scale to a team and has to be repeatable and has to deal with the fact that like certain people are to leave the organization and, you want to go, well, how do we retain a certain amount of that knowledge or that output they created and be able to reuse it and build best practices. Like right now, the AI tools aren't really built for that. They're very much built for an individualized experience. They continue to sort of double down on an individualized experience, sort of the memory of an individual, but it doesn't really, there aren't really kind of the frameworks in place to do, what Slack does, or even what SharePoint does, or what some of these collaboration tools do, or the wiki experience that, again, that's an older experience and so forth, but like that doesn't really exist. And that's something that from an enterprise perspective, if you're not able to, kind of collectivize within your organization the learning curve of new things, be able to maintain things for longer periods of time, not just an individual's calendar or 2 or 3 people or something. It's right now it is a very, very individualized experience. And again, that's driven by the need for sort of hyper individualization that happens in sort of the B2C experience, which again sort of ties to like it's monetized by ads and all that sort of stuff that is interesting, and it's interesting in the bigger picture of things, but it isn't necessarily the center of what makes the technology interesting to an enterprise. And so that I think still has a long way to go. So anyways, just some insights and some feedback is having a whole bunch of conversations with different companies. Again, don't take this as like stuff's not happening in the enterprise. I think it is still a very, very high priority for the vast majority of companies and enterprises. But I think we are, as much as we are seeing all sorts of, I'll say positive things happening and sort of forward movement happening in the B2C space and frontier model space and the investment space and all that sort of stuff. In the enterprise space, where things are just inherently more complicated because it is a mix of what's new and what's old, and you have to think about organizations and ramping up skill sets and having teams supporting other people, and privacy concerns and security concerns and location concerns and all those sort of things and collaboration concerns. I think the enterprise is just right now on a different time frame in terms of what does broader success look like, what does security requirements look like, all those sorts of things that you think about with the enterprise that sort of bum people out sometimes, but just are the reality of working in larger organizations and providing services to large numbers of people on a B2B basis, in many cases. So anyways, just some feedback, would love to hear other people's feedback on, kind of what they're seeing in the marketplace, where I got things wrong, where I'm not seeing things, I've got blind spots. Would love to hear that as well. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. Hopefully this is a somewhat useful framework. I'd be curious if others, are seeing this, if they think their numbers, are vastly different, or if there are other sort of categories in terms of maturities of where companies are. I'd love to hear that feedback. Again, you can shoot it to us at show at thecloudcast.net, or you can DM us or hit us up through any of the social channels and so forth. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Folks, thanks for listening. Hope you're having a good October, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.